the cat and mouse game. We've got the blue team or the defender. We have the adversary constantly trying to knock down the walls that we put up. One of the tools that we're going to use is endpoint detection and response and extended detection and response. And this is going to help us detect and respond to things that may have passed through our preventative capabilities. And so when we look at this, I like to frame it a little bit. So remember NotPetya. I know this is not the latest and greatest, but it was certainly interesting, and it shows some of the challenges you have when you're just focused on something like endpoint detection and response. There's some limitations in regards to the data that you're going to get. It's still critically important to have it, but you may want to extend it so you can get some extended detection and response capabilities that go beyond the endpoint itself. And so NotPetya, it was an exploit that was allegedly stolen from the NSA, was created by the NSA by a group called Shadow Brokers. Microsoft had released a patch a month earlier before the exploit was publicly available. And the interesting elements of NotPetya were the ability, once it compromised an asset, to the ability to harvest credentials and move in and log into assets just using username and passwords that they were able to harvest out of memory. So some complexities there for sure. You've got networking components, you've got endpoint components. All of that could help determine, what took place, DNS calls, etc. Interesting article here from Wired. You might want to check out as well. So when we go through this, a couple things we want to think about is, there's NotPetya, but what if NotPetya 2 happens, right? Or what happens with the next latest and greatest attack that takes place? And so there's a couple questions leadership typically asks teams, and those are, do we have protection mechanisms in place to defend against this new campaign? The other is, have we been targeted, right? Have we been compromised? And if we have, what actually took place? And so endpoint detection and response and extended detection and response certainly can help facilitate this. The other element is Locard's exchange principle. So he's the Sherlock Holmes of France, and he helped create forensic science around forensic evidence in crime. And so basically what he says is that if an adversary or criminal, right, as they enter a crime scene and exit a crime scene, it's impossible to either not leave something behind or take something from it. And so that puts you at the timing of what might have taken place. The problem or challenge is how do you find that information, right? So it could be a hair follicle falling into a fiber carpet. Very difficult to find. But if you have the tools and mechanisms to be able to find that, at least now you can place somebody at the scene, maybe not at the time of what took place, but at least at the scene. And again, the more evidence that you collect, the more information the more information that it provides is going to help you determine what took place. And so systems are the same way, right? This might be a DNS request from your local coffee shop off your on-premise environment. And this is where it all starts. It could be a USB key, right, with a weaponized PDF. And so the goal as a defender or a responder is being able to collect that information. So if there was an incident, obviously now you have the details to understand truly what happened. Ultimately, we want to protect or 100% prevent everything that takes place. But the reality is that we're not going to be able to do that. And that's why these detection response capabilities are so important. So when we get into endpoint detection response, specifically, we've got a couple things in the market today. You got EPP, so endpoint protection and prevention, right? Tools. They get into things like anti-malware. You might have firewalling, USB control and things like that. Then you moving into pure play endpoint detection response capabilities. This is going to tell you exactly what happened. This process executed. Hopefully a PowerShell script that talks about the command line that was leveraged in that, and it made a call out to this IP address and pulled down this dropper file. Like that's the type of information that you're expecting out of an endpoint detection response tool. And then finally, you have the merging of these two, right? And so you've got some of that EPP, endpoint protection or prevention capabilities, and then you got endpoint detection and response capabilities. So you got a little bit of both. Typically, players that have the EPP component have very rich EDR capabilities, and now are extending the capabilities to provide prevention as well. So that's kind of the market. We're going to get into an investigation. We're really going to look and peel back the onion of what types of data that we would like to get out of an endpoint detection response capability. So we're not talking prevention at all here. So we've got a timeline, right? And we get this ticket. And this ticket says, I've saw this command line box, basically. And it shows, and maybe this user, and this would be a phenomenal user that screen scrapes it and sends this ticket in and says, look, I see this resume.exe command prompt, like, it's not doing anything, right? And so that's the ticket. And so the thing is where do you start? What do you do at this point? Right? Do you take this information, you go scan their endpoint? Do you go to the tool that manages that endpoint and do an investigation there? This is where the challenge starts. And so what we can do is we certainly can, if we have endpoint detection response, we know a couple things right now, right? We know the file name itself is resume.exe. We don't have a SHA-256 at this point, but we know that the file name is resume.exe. We know the device is Windows 10, and the reason why we know that is because the ticket was created, right? We know the user was Jack Tripper because that's who created the help desk ticket. And we know the user is unaware of how this happened, right? But obviously concerned. And so that's what we know so far. And so our goal now as analysts or responders is now figure out, how did resume.exe get executed? How did this happen? And so what is our next step, right? So you might go to a bunch of different tools. You might go to your endpoint detection and response capability. And maybe it's as simple as you do a search for resume.exe on your EDR platform. And you're going to have a timeline, and you are going to see some interesting elements, and you're going to trace back what took place. So the first thing we see is a creation, maybe an execution. And then depending on the technology, you might see a retrospective event. And so what this is showing you is that where that retrospective event happens is that there may have been the adversary was successful to a certain point, and then the defensive capabilities now understand what that file resume.exe is now malicious. And this could be through sandboxing, a different or additional insight into a threat intelligence, etc. It could be a user's deemed this file as now malicious and marked it. And retrospection now ultimately would prevent any further execution of that payload. Now, there could have been droppers and a bunch of other stuff that were pulled. If that's not associated, obviously that's going to continue. And so what our goal now is that we feel that there's a prevention mechanism that kicked in, but we still don't know what took place and how it happened. And you may still want to know if you've, been leaking data or things like that as well. And so when we look at this creation, we can see it was created by PowerShell. And so that's tremendously valuable right away. So now we know it's PowerShell. We see the relationship between resume.exe and PowerShell. And the next thing we see is that we got this command line argument that was passed when PowerShell was executed. And now what we see is that PowerShell actually went out to this ret.space port 8080. In most organizations, that may not even get out, right? If you're controlling outbound access. In this case, it did. And then it went and downloaded payload resume.exe and actually executed or started that process on the endpoint. And that's what we got already. And maybe the technology provided a cloud-based IOC, and that cloud-based IOC gives us some information here as well. And that indicator of compromise is talking about that a macro it can be used or is indicated to be used here. and it was and it can be used in nefarious ways, such as macro calling a PowerShell that goes out to pull this file down and execute the payload. So that's pretty good. We know Windward, it was the responsible actor here of launching PowerShell. So that definitely associates this IOC triggered that we see here. So what do we know so far? So we know PowerShell was involved in the creation of resume.exe. We know that we have an IOC that indicates a macro was used to launch PowerShell. So what is our next step here? Like, we've got a lot of good information already, right? We know Word was involved. We know PowerShell. We've got a macro. We know resume.exe. We do have the SHA-256 now of resume.exe, so we can use that to do additional blocking and further analysis. So I think the next thing that we want to do is figure out, how did Windward get involved here, right? What happened? And so when we look at that payload, what we can see is that Explorer launched Windward. When it did that, we can see that there's a parameter that was passed, and that command line parameter was go ahead and open Windward and execute that document, right? Or expose that document for viewing. And that was resume.m, right? So doc.m is macro as well, right? So there's another indicator. We have an IOC that triggered based on our endpoint detection and response capabilities that indicated macro. And now we do see a document that is macro enabled, right? And so obviously you can prevent that by not allowing macros, but in this case, obviously macros were allowed. And so now what do we know? What are the additional information that we get captured here? Well, we know Windward launched PowerShell using a macro. We've confirmed that now. And we know that Explorer launched Windward in order to view the document, resume.m. So the next thing is, how did resume.m get here? So that's still missing. And so the next step is probably highlight and focus on resume.m. And when we do that, what we end up seeing is that there's a created document from outlook.exe. And so the conclusion would be now is Outlook was the source of resume.m. That's what endpoint detection and response. You might see outbound connections to certain IP addresses, but that's the idea around endpoint detection and response. I've got a fairly comprehensive story of what happened on that endpoint. The problem is that I only see what happened here on the endpoint. Now I can take a lot of these things that I've learned here and start now investigating further, but that's really where extended detection and response comes in. But further to that, one of the capabilities that you typically do see with endpoint detection and response is the ability to sandbox. And so if the technology allows for that, there should be a report mechanism that comes from that. And so that report itself is going to give us some additional insight. So, the goal here would be is that resume.exe would be detonated in a sandbox, and we would watch everything that took place, right, through an automated process or through an analyst that wants to interact with the payload that they're submitting to a sandbox. And so here what we can see is, this is just an example, is that we've got a threat score of 100, talks about, it's a PE32 file, Windows 10 is the operating system that it was launched. But we can see a couple behavioral indicators: poison ivy default, mutex detected. We've got antivirus, machine learning models, and bypass and flagged by antivirus, registry persistence, some really good behavioral indicator information. And this is just a quick high-level summary. We also see DNS traffic, and there's that ret.space. So that's what we saw in our endpoint detection and response as the PowerShell made that communication outbound. And we can see that resume.exe, it also has some relationship with ret.space as well. We see any of the TCP IP streams, we see extracted domains, we see processes that are included, any artifacts that are associated with it. We got registry keys, creation, modification, deletion, file activity, right? These are all the things that happen when a payload's being executed in a sandbox environment. But it does provide us with additional insight. So that endpoint detection and response, tremendously valuable. We've got some great details there. But we learn a whole lot more by letting that payload run in a sandboxed environment and having the sandbox provide a reporting mechanism to give us additional insight. And so this is an example of MITRE ATT&CK framework that also provides you insight into, what are some of the tactics and techniques that are being used. And again, now you can take these and leverage these in your defensive capabilities and truly understand what the adversary had done. All right, now when we take a step back and look at it, we can see it visually, right? We see Outlook involved with resume.m, which opened up Windward, which invoked a macro, which started PowerShell, that went to ret.space, downloaded resume.exe, and started that process. And we've captured a couple other things, right? We've got a file SHA-256, we've got the domain name, we've got an IP address, we even got the port number in this case. So these all can be used to help facilitate defensive capabilities in the rest of our defensive platforms that exist. So whether that be a next-gen firewall, DNS layer security, email, etc., these are all elements that I can leverage. Around behavioral side of it though, right, the sandboxing element provided much more detail as well, right? Poison ivy mutex, we know that's a remote access Trojan. We know the campaign being used. We also have a mutex that we can use something like OS query and go ahead and search our entire fleet of assets to see if we have any residual indicating compromise. We have remote command shell. We've got keylogger, screenshots, file management, encrypted communication. So we know some of the behaviors. And so maybe we want to change the user's password, make sure MFA is in place, look for certain encrypted communications coming out of assets. We also know antivirus and machine learning modules suggest that this was flagged as malicious. We've got persistence around the executable in a temporary folder. We have MITRE ATT&CK framework. So now we know the tactic, which is persistence, technique, boot, log on, and auto start using the registry keys or startup folders. Privilege escalation is the tactic against the techniques are the same. But what's good here is again, we can use something like OS query and search to see if we have any residual. Look in those registry keys to see if the entry's there. Look at the startup folder. But definitely things that allow us to expand our investigation. You've got TCP and IP streams, processes, artifacts, registry, DNS entries, file activities, all of that's included. Scripts, we know it's macro and PowerShell, so we can do additional investigation around that, maybe additional controls in place. An application threat source we know was Outlook.exe in this particular case. So that's really, really great insight. So we've been able to peel back that initial screenshot, and this is all the details we know, but it's only focused on the endpoint. And in this case, only one specific endpoint. Now, when we start scanning and using something like OS query, we might find some additional assets that have been compromised. But there's more to this story, potentially, and we've completely ignored it up to this point. Again, endpoint detection and response, tremendously valuable. You can't get away without having it. But what email did it come in on? Right? Who sent the email? Anyone else impacted? Right? How do we ensure our defensive capabilities are leveraging this new information so we can defend against that particular attack? And so this is where we start getting into extended detection and response. So the EDR is tremendously valuable on the assets it's installed on and provides a tremendous amount of insight into what took place. but it doesn't complete the story. And this is where things, or where defensive teams struggle, or investigators can struggle. And what happens is, what you'll find is you'll get reoccurrence of compromise because you're missing elements. You haven't been able to defend, and they continue to propagate. So with extended detection and response, we start thinking about things like malware and IPS, security intelligence events. We've got flow alarms. All of this we want to be sent to a platform where we could obviously use this in our investigations. But we also got files, email, DNS, sandboxing, web, IP address, endpoints, forensics. We want actionable data, systemic response. We want to know the tactics and techniques being used, and we need some automation. So think of this as almost a nervous system and truly understanding of what's taking place, and having that ability to take more of a platform-based approach to your investigations, and the ability to take that information and respond with it as well. And you might even think about orchestration at some point, right? Where you start looking at certain activities that might take place and have an automated, fully automated response around an email address that seems to be suspect in regards to the attachments it has, and have it continually go through the process and empower your teams with information so they don't have to do a lot of that manual stuff. So let's dig into extended detection and response, and let's see if we can complete this story. And so we already understand what took place on the endpoint, but we could have potentially used XDR and searched for resume.exe as an example. Or we may have started in endpoint detection and response. Doesn't really matter. The goal ultimately is to figure out exactly what took place. So let's do that search, and all of a sudden we've got this SHA-256 that shows up. We've got this, and it's malicious, and we've got this clean file that has an association with it. We can assume that's PowerShell, but we can obviously dig into it. You've got some folder paths here, and here's a file name that is actually assigned to that SHA-256. So we see that correlation there, and we see a target. And so this is really what we've seen up to this point. In fact, we actually know more with the EDR component because we were able to dig in and figure out exactly what happened on the endpoint. But let's continue. So now we have this information. We've got some clickable, that's what the gray dots represent, clickable items, so we can dig deeper into each element. We may even take action, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But let's also add in ret.space, right? We saw that association earlier on, and so that's an indicator that we would want to use here. And so when we do that, we get the domain ret.space, and all of a sudden now we've got two more targets. Now, we don't see an association with resume.exe. Maybe they have something on their laptop, desktop, or whatever that prevented resume.exe from actually taking place. Maybe they don't have an endpoint agent, and it is on there as an example, right? They don't have EDR on these endpoints, and maybe it is on there. The thing is that we know that they made a call to ret.space. And so we don't know if that's through a USB key. We don't have any insight into that, but what we have or discovered is two more potential targets, right? And so we continue through this process, and now we want to look at resume.m. And so we see resume.m shows up. We see that it's red or malicious. Green means clean. And we see a file name associated to that, the Outlook, and that's something that we've already have good insight into. And we see the file name for that malicious file is resume.docm. And you can see the association with the target asset as well. And so that completes that picture here, but we've got two new endpoints. We still don't have a full visual into the story, but as this draws out, what we end up seeing is here's the message IDs that are associated to that resume.docm. And so that there's an email address to jason@cisco.com, and there's another one to Jack, that's Jack Tripper at cisco.com. And so that message ID 262 is associated with that campaign. And so now we've really completed that element, at least in regards to how did it get in? Well, we know it was Outlook, but we know it was email sent to Jack, which is good. We know the IP addressing. We know the email subject. It was resume.:11223. Maybe that's the job description or the job identifier. But we know that was part of it, but we know Jason also got it as well. We also know that there is a domain linked in that message and a URL as well. We've got an IP address that might have communicated with that URL. So now we've got an initial internal network based host that made a connection to that URL. And then over here in the middle, we've got this email, and it's coming in from, @bad.com. And that was the sending email address that sent the message to Jason at Cisco and Jack at Cisco. Now, one of these endpoints up here may have been associated with that email, meaning Jason might have been logged on here, and then this might be Jill as an example. And so we really don't know. Maybe Jason or Jack copied it to a USB and sent it over. They executed the resume.exe. They don't have resume.m. They don't have EDR capabilities, but we've seen the reach out to the domain itself. So there's a lot more to this story, right? And so what we end up finding out is that, we might want to dig into that network of 192.168.10.1. We want to look at Jason a little bit more closely and those targets. And maybe there's additional insight that we gather that, again, shows additional compromise. But if we wanted to take action, this is where we want to be able to click on the endpoint, maybe grab or isolate it. We might want to take forensics. Might even want to take that SHA-256 or maybe an unknown file and block it. We might want to search it in a sandbox for additional analysis. But we want to be able to have the ability from the platform to make decisions against the information that it's providing us. But visually, this is tremendously valuable. So was there more to the story? Absolutely. We have 2 more targeted endpoints. We have 2 targeted internal email users. We have additional emails, domains, URLs, and IPs all to work from. And we also answered those 2 questions, right? We know we've been compromised. We know we have defensive capabilities in place because we can see that the files themselves are showing up as malicious. So as long as we have that capability based on the identification of this being malicious, we can defend against it. So whether that be in endpoint prevention platform, it could be an email, a next-gen firewall, etc. Same thing with the domain. We know that they're bad or suspicious, and therefore we could be mitigating that control using some DNS-based control. We know the whole story. Now, again, we could extend this to look a little bit more on each endpoint, etc., but you get the idea, right? I have to stop it at some point. We know the whole story. So there's obviously the email came in from @bad.com targeting 2 users. It had an attachment called resume.m, and users obviously launched that using outlook.exe. And when word got launched, macro got enabled, PowerShell was invoked and went to ret.space. It downloaded that resume.exe. So pretty cool stuff. So that's a little bit about endpoint detection and response, and then expanding it to extended detection and response. Cool.